Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the latest Urban Living webinar. And today we are going to be discussing Gen Alpha, and this is a fascinating subject and one which, while we were researching this webinar, we couldn't find too much information about. So we're hopefully going to enlighten you today. My name's George Sell. I'm editor of Urban Living News, and I head up the editorial department at IHM. And we are a provider of B2B news websites for the real estate and hospitality industries. And we also organise events too. The webinar is going to last an hour. We'd like to make it as interactive as we can, so if you have any questions for us, please submit them using the Q&A or the chat function. We'll either get around to answering them there and then, or we'll save them for a few minutes at the end of the session. Everybody who's registered for the webinar will get a link to a recording over the next few days. So just to give today's discussion some context, I just wanted to read out a few of these bullet points about Gen Alpha, because there's some quite interesting stuff here. So basically, they're those born between 2010 and the end of this year. More than 2.8 million are born globally every week. And by the end of this year, when the cutoff point is for this generation, they will number almost 2 billion. So numerically, they'll be the largest generation in history. They are the most materially endowed generation ever, the most technologically savvy generation ever, and they will enjoy a longer lifespan than any previous generation. While they are the youngest generation, they have brand influence and purchasing power beyond their years. They shape the social media landscape, are popular culture influencers, emerging consumers, and by the end of this decade, they'll be moving into adulthood, the workforce, and household formation. They will stay in education longer, which is particularly pertinent for student accommodation providers, starting their earning years later and stay at home with their parents later than their predecessors, Gen Z and Gen Y. And by 2029, when the oldest alphas enter into adulthood and the youngest reach the age of 5, their economic footprint will reach more than nearly $5.5 trillion US. So this is a huge potential market out there for accommodation and hospitality providers. Okay, so we've got a great panel to discuss Gen Alpha today, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves from left to right as we see them on the slide. So first of all, Sarah, good morning to you.
Morning, George. Thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm Sarah Canning. I'm the co-founder of the Property Marketing Strategist. We're marketing consultants specialising in the shared living sectors. So we work across PBSA, BTR, co-living, co-working, suppliers, universities. And we also do a lot of research for the sector, which we provide for free. But so far, that's all been focused on Gen Z. Or Gen Z. And like you said, there's not so much research being done on Gen Alpha. So a lot of what we think we know about Gen Alpha is assumptions. But I guess because of the research that we've done into Gen Z, you can kind of see how that's been moving over the last few years and how it might move into the next few years as well.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And Stuart, good morning to you.
Good morning, and thanks, George, for having us along today. Stuart Henderson from Mees. Mees is the first values-led student housing company. We are the first UK student living company to be awarded pending B Corp status, and we bring together a vertically integrated specialist investment team where we acquire, develop, and manage student accommodation assets across Europe.
Thank you, Stuart. And finally, Lucy, welcome to you.
Hi, morning everybody. My name is Lucy Green. I'm the founder of Light Years Consulting. Broadly, I would say this what we specialize in is the connection between trend forecasting and consumer insight and brand strategy. And when I talk about trend forecasting, it's really 3 key areas. So consumer insight, and a lot of that is generational cohort work. So I've done a lot of work interviewing a lot of Gen Zs, and more recently looking at Gen Alpha. Looking at how that connects to cultural trends as the sort of second bucket, and then as a third area, looking at the future of various different sectors. And all those 3 things really connect, you know, how startups and direct consumer companies are funneling into connect to culture, but also connect to consumer values as they evolve. But Gen Alpha are really exciting to me, so I'm excited to be here.
Great, thank you, Lucy, and thank you all. Okay, so we have done a little bit of our own research. We spoke to a couple of Gen Alphas and asked them some questions about accommodation, travel, and that kind of stuff. Isla and Finley, and what they said was actually really interesting. So we're just going to watch a video that lasts 5 or 6 minutes and hear a little bit from the horse's mouth, as it were.
Well, I like to walk to places if it's like less than 5 minutes away. We have an electric car, and I like places that recycle.
I'll start with travel, and I think, yes, you are allowed to go on planes. It does use a lot of carbon and stuff. But you're allowed to go on holiday every so often, because who doesn't love a good holiday? And but let's say you're going to like France or something, you can use electric cars. Yes, some people don't have electric cars, but consider it, or use trains. And when, let's say you just need to pop down to the shop, maybe go on the bike or a scooter or walk, because you have all those options instead of wasting your time in a car.
Okay. And what about the accommodation? How important would that be?
I think, yeah, everyone wants to go to one of them, like Lux hotels, etc. But try to think about what they could do to help the environment. Like, they could reuse their energy, reuse food, recycle food, give food to local food banks, and help out like the world around them. It would be a big choice, because UK, I would probably prefer to live in London if we're talking about cities, because I think London's a great place to like live, work in, etc. And if we were talking overseas, I would like talk like probably like America, like New York, because again, that's like kind of like the opposite, like not opposite, but it's like the same as like London. So I think you can get a lot of noise and stuff, but I think it would still be a great place to live at, because you've got so much like facilities and stuff.
Overseas, I would probably say New York or LA, and in England, I prefer to stay maybe Manchester or Cheltenham. I prefer to live in co-living and with my friends, and it's usually big and it'll be fun.
I would prefer to live with my friends, because when you're alone, I think, yes, you have like the space to work in and you can concentrate, but I think you would feel more comfortable starting, like, let's say, the term off or the year off with people who you know. I would prefer to live in a flat share with my friends, because I feel like when it comes to a big community centre or a big like co-living like place where people work, you can, like, strangers is like a point that like I think I personally would get scared of, and like losing focus for like your studies, like when the term starts or something like that. And I think when you're with your friends, they would all be on the same like track as you, so you could all focus like in your own area.
I prefer to have a smaller room and more amenities, as there's more things to do, like a cinema room, a swimming pool, sports, and a gaming room.
I think personally I would prefer a small room and like more like amenities, because I think when like you come to like in that area, you just want a space that you can focus, and I think having a big room where loads of people would probably some kind of walk in sometimes, that would be like pretty annoying, so you would lose focus and stuff. Whereas I think a small room, you could really like make yourself feel at home and just concentrate more than having like a big room.
I prefer to live in Airbnb. That it's usually bigger, there's more space, and I can do what I want.
A hotel, because I think you have so many good facilities in a hotel that like you can use any time of the day, and you kind of like you can get the drinks, etc. You can get your food. Whereas let's say you're staying in an Airbnb, most of the time you're gonna have to go out for shopping food, and you're gonna have to go out for meals and stuff. Whereas I think in a hotel you have it like all there for you.
I I think branded because it will have higher standards and the accommodation will be more reliable. I would expect there to be a key card and even automatic lights and voice control on a TV.
Definitely good Wi-Fi, so you can like Google stuff, you can look on the internet, like etc. So you can like use up your time. Like if you have time, just go on your phone, your laptop, etc. Probably like a TV, so you can log into like Netflix or Disney Plus or any other like apps you have on the TV. Sensor lights, so like let's say you just walk in and you have like a handful of stuff, they'll just turn on automatically. Like a voice activated machine, they can be bought, but I think some people love listening to music while they study, and I think it would be just good to have it there. And lastly, probably good like heating, so like let's say it's cold, just turn the heating on and you're nice and warm throughout like your room.
All right, so thanks to Isla and Finley. I thought that was great, and I think the first thing that occurred to me was some of the things they expect, like voice activated technology, were purely in the realms of science fiction when I was a student, which shows you how fast the world is moving. But I really enjoyed that. Lucy, do you want to kick off? What were your sort of main takeaways from that? Was that broadly in line with what you would have expected?
Yeah, I mean, to begin with, just the huge sense of literacy and agency about brands and services and how as consumers, how sophisticated they are already. So already adopting values that you might have learnt as an adult previously. Even to the point of, it's clearly we're in a mature Airbnb economy where we're at I would personally argue we're at the sort of start of the Airbnb backlash, or the platform backlash, let's say, in terms of property rentals. And so, yeah, and then, as you say, on the technology front, it's really interesting. They've been dubbed the iPad generation, but I think one of the most remarkable things about them is that they've been raised with completely different interactions with the internet, this idea of the ambient internet. Like, so a lot of them find speaking to the internet very intuitive, but also when they're looking at screens, not necessarily typing, they're used to sort of gestural interfaces. So the whole way that hospitality brands will need to interact with this group is very different to how previous brands might have thought about it before.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. Sarah, what did you make of that, particularly on the kind of whole piece around leaving home and starting your studies and preferences of that nature?
Well, as I have my own Gen Alpha 12-year-old, I'm delighted to hear that they're going to stay at home with their family for longer. So that was really positive to me. He's not going anywhere. But yeah, I think I wasn't surprised that technology played such a big part in their views about future accommodation. I thought the travel piece was really interesting. I'm amazed that they kind of consider the world to be their oyster, really, and that's no boundary, really. And I think that's really, really positive, and hopefully our kind of governments and visas, etc., will allow that kind of travel and study in the future, and there could be a world where there are less boundaries for those opportunities to be realised. And I also thought a bit about kind of co-living. And if I asked my 12-year-old, he would want a football pitch in the garden and somewhere to play PlayStation with his mates. It would be like Party Central, which is why I don't want him to leave home. And that kind of wanting to live with your friends is actually really refreshing, because actually a lot of the research that we've seen, I think off the back of COVID with Gen Z, is that they've become quite insular. There's a lot of things that they prefer to do alone. We just did a piece of research for a client about social spaces, and they actually would prefer to watch TV on their own. They would prefer to study on their own. So I'm really kind of feeling positive that maybe that will come out the other side with Gen Alpha, and they will want more face-to-face contact again.
Thanks, Sarah. Stuart, both Isla and Finley there agreed that when it comes to student accommodation or co-living or something similar, they were happy to have a smaller unit in exchange for more amenities. Is that the kind of general view? Is that the way that student properties and co-living are moving?
Well, I think firstly on the co-living point, they've probably got a better description of an understanding of what co-living is than most of the market does. So I think there's some real positive thoughts from that maybe they're going to shape what that product is as the market still really tries to define it. I think on that point, there's a skepticism in my head that comes in that says maybe does that change when you then come to see how small a room could be, or things that you want to have in your space, and maybe that's me being influenced by, as Sarah says, maybe this idea of people wanting to be in the loan studios, etc., that have kind of come through versus then going into the shared apartments and what you're having to share. The experience of maybe what we're seeing now or what we've seen in the past is maybe hindering that slightly for me. But I think the idea of amenity space and wanting to share is great. I think the sectors that we're talking about here are very well versed to deliver that. The challenge that we have in a lot of these markets is planning constraints, etc., to allow you to go and to deliver something quite futuristic in those spaces that maybe meets the requirements or the desires of those students or future students coming through. So I think it's all really, really interesting. And at the last point, I just want to pick up on there that I touched on, it's that importance of brand. I think that's really, really interesting. And it's something that we've been talking about internally on having something that you believe in, or you understand what you're actually going to get from somewhere or some company, and making sure that your brand values are strong and that's something that's going to be attractive to the generation coming through.
Yeah. Sarah, do you want to pick up on that point?
I think it was more about the amenities and what, I guess part of the reason why maybe there isn't so much research into Gen Alpha is the lack of context that they have when we're talking to 12-year-olds about what they want when they're 18. And I guess the part about amenities, the kind of, is about price really, and they wouldn't have a context of that. So, and we wouldn't expect them to either. But by the time they come to 18, that kind of consideration about smaller room and more amenities, that goes hand in hand with affordability. And we're seeing particularly in the kind of student accommodation sector, that those costs, the product is incredible, so the cost supports that. But obviously that will become a real choice, and especially, we don't know where tuition fee costs are going. They've remained stagnant for longer than they should have, and that's putting universities under immense pressure. So they're likely to go up. Accommodation is going to keep going up. So I wonder how much of a genuine choice that will be in 5 years' time. As to whether a lot of students will be able to afford these amazing amenitized spaces. Yeah,
interesting point. The other thing that I found interesting there was how they completely disagreed about the kind of accommodation they wanted when they travel. So Airbnb versus an all-inclusive hotel, and I wonder, that's probably got a lot to do with what your family unit already does and the kind of things that you're used to staying in. But all good stuff. Lucy, of the research that is already out there about Gen Alpha, what do we know about how they differ from Gen Z in terms of their traits, habits, and preferences?
I think it's almost, I actually think there's more sort of continuity, except maybe perhaps a bit more idealism, and also because I think it's important to remember that they're the first generation of children to be born to millennials. So there's a huge millennial influence on them as consumers. I almost think of Gen Z as the sort of punk renegade next version of Gen X in some ways, like anti-corporate, cynical, whatever. But Gen Alphas have been raised by millennials with a lot of their sort of similar values and sensibilities, raised on complete consumer centricity. I think you can't underestimate the role of Instagram, which is playing a role in the kind of toys that they're being given, the kind of brands that they interact with, the kind of experiences they're being served up in hotels. Instagram is still a primary driver in how these things are curated and executed. for millennial parents. Oh, I've created a new word. Happy Friday. So I think you do see this. The influence of millennials in terms of visual and brand values. But I also just think there's an assumption that they are quite cynical, and that because they are the so-called iPad generation, there is data to prove out that they're early adopters of internet, social media, smartphones, iPads, and so on. But what I found in a lot of the research and the experts that I've been speaking to recently is that has actually driven a real appreciation for the outdoors, and for time offline, and for time to interact with others. And so hence you see really amazing experiences like the V&A Children's Museum now really focusing on offline analog experiences, multi-generational play versus, I think there was an obsession before with kids being taught how to code and be STEM and be scientists, and that really has switched, and it's also being driven by Gen Alphas themselves and their curiosities and their tastes.
Do you want to share with us the anecdote that you said when we spoke the other day about how millennial aesthetics are being imposed on Gen Zs, with the ball pool example, because that made me laugh.
No, exactly. I guess it's good that the sort of millennial values are which are sustainability, ethical, direct to consumer, transparent, all of that. But on a recent piece of research I was working on, one cultural critic was talking about how the millennial aesthetic is sort of detrimental to kids. She talked about the sort of the branding, the quintessential branding that we've seen in millennial pink and like muted tones is being enforced on children by their millennial parents who want them to live in their Instagram aesthetic. It's even led to like very popular accounts like Sad Beige, which is led by an American comic called Haley DeRoche. And she jokes that it's always a series of videos basically looking at these sort of muted beige and cream and brown children's toys and environments and clothing, and she refers to it as the sort of the Werner Herzog of children's interiors. People will know who Werner Herzog is. He's a very austere German director, but she sort of talks about how it's sort of similar, which I thought was very funny. But there is this blanding of children's culture, whereas bright colors, black and white, and stimulus, and not bad taste, but like eclectic taste, bright colors. It's not about taste when you're under 13 necessarily. It's being sort of wiped out by this very stringent millennial Instagram affair.
It's not quite seen and not heard. It's seen as long as you're aesthetically pleasing and well designed and tasteful. Yeah, it's interesting stuff. Sarah, what's your intuition about how the next kind of cohort of student and co-living residents from Gen Alpha, how do you think they're going to differ from Gen Z? Are there going to be any key differences that the providers are going to have to cater for?
I think the main one is technology. The latest piece of research we did showed quite a lot of skepticism actually in Gen Z about smart technology, how their data is being used, being spied on, the security of it. So I think as long as that can be more transparent and people can get more comfortable with it, I just think that Gen Alpha have no patience whatsoever. They have, their attention spans are reducing. So when we start looking at like booking accommodation, for example, they are not going to have the patience to fill in forms and for them not to be kind of AI integrated. We've just mentioned before about the swipe generation. They're used to touching things. They're used to things being auto-populated. If you put something in one form, you expect that to be auto-populated into another one. And I do think that technology will need to catch up, and that's whether you're booking hotels or whether you're booking accommodation, because like I said, they'll switch off if you are asking things that you don't need to be asking in order to book a room, or it's taking too long, or the information that you're asking isn't being integrated, and that follows through into their rooms as well. you know, if you go into a hotel, quite often you get on the screen, you know, hello Sarah, you know, welcome to whatever. We don't see anything like that in student accommodation, where kind of it's set up ready for you, that your kind of wants and needs have been taken into account. And wouldn't, you know, they're going to expect that you walk into your room, they're going to know, you know, your room will know what temperature you want it to be. They might have your favorite music playing. You know, I think they're going to really expect things at the tap of a finger instantly, and that's quite a lot to take in and quite a lot to adapt in 5 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Stuart, we were talking earlier about, you know, your plans to grow your portfolio and to buy and build assets. So and you know, but with the timescales that we're looking at for funding, planning, construction, and so on, these guys are going to be your customers in these assets. So what do you think your properties will do differently from previous generations of accommodation that have catered to Gen Z and before?
I think technology is the obvious focus here, and Sarah just touched on loads and loads of absolutely relevant points, and I think there's two ways that you got to think about this at the moment in terms of the wider context of the markets and the housing crisis that's going on at the moment, and what impacts that's going to have versus the futuristic view of what, as you say, the buildings that are going to go for planning through now need to actually deliver. If you answer that one first, you absolutely can go blue sky thinking and all the things that came up in the video when you're talking about voice activation control. We've already got key card, you know, phone access onto rooms, and we're now seeing great things coming in around energy and sustainability. The buildings are already seeing retrofitted and built with, and I think then you think about things like AI and how do you build them into whether it's your bookings process or your building. And I think, you know, that does seem to be pushing forward and advancing so quickly that, you know, my take with AI is I also always never really know how to use AI, because I'm always trying to think about the here and now rather than people who are thinking about AI are thinking about the future, and that's how they manage to push it on so quickly. I think my challenge on how do we deliver some of these things that we're talking about when we put into context that kind of housing crisis that's going on at the moment. The markets are starting to turn, but that doesn't mean that there's going to be an absolute influx of new deliveries coming through with the way build costs are and where they are. So actually we need to think about it. The reality is there will be students moving into accommodation in 5-6 years time that will be moving into buildings, whether they're university assets or in the private sector, that were built in the 1990s or 1980s, buildings that haven't been retrofitted. And actually there's still a place for these when Sarah touches on the affordability element of that, but they're not going to meet the requirements or the desires or expectations of Gen Alpha students coming through. So operators and universities then need to think about, well, how do we still have to pivot around to try and deliver some of these things, which then comes down to the experience that you're delivering, and that might be to do with your brand or other areas that you're focusing on. So one of the areas I would think about here is things like neurodivergent students are coming through. I think that's going to be an increased number. So actually, how do you deliver your service or the experience that you're looking to deliver that caters for a growing number of students in this area? And that could be for many different kind of period effects, such as COVID or other areas that are having an impact on these students. So there's real focus that operators can deliver things there that might not be going out and spending thousands of capital investment to add technology to buildings. And then other areas around kind of ESG kind of things that we've kind of touched on there. So that, you know, I think again in the video it came up, we want to see things like built things that operators are doing, things like recycling, things like renewable energy. But actually, these are going to continue to become more and more important. And I don't think that's just a Gen Alpha thing. I think that's something that we're seeing right across society now. That expectation is just going to continue to grow and grow. So what can you do? What can you stand behind? And then how do you kind of find the governance behind that? Or how are you really setting the standard and making sure you're owning up to it? Because it's great to say things. I think these generations are going to want to see more proof that you are actually delivering that in your brand. So what kind of areas can you deliver there? And that's where we've kind of been going down the B Corp route as a business to try and find that stamp of I can't think of the word you're talking about, but you know, that's something that says that actually you are delivering this as a business, and you are delivering these standards, the highest standards that customers would expect.
We'll move on to talk about branding and marketing in a bit, but I think B Corp is going to be a brand that this generation are going to really look for. You know, not just in property and accommodation, but you know, across their consumer journeys. Sarah, as well as the technology, do you think there's any specific changes or ways that building and unit room design need to evolve to cater for this generation?
In student accommodation, I would love to see the rooms evolve more, because at the moment you generally look at for a 13 square metre room with a bed, a desk and a wardrobe, and that hasn't really changed for the past kind of 30 years, really, probably even before that. And you might think, well, what more does a young person want? And that's, you know, that's the big question. How else will they use their space? One thing that we've seen change in the last few years, which I think will continue to change, is soundproofing. It doesn't sound very sexy, but students are in their room a lot more than they ever have been before. They're watching Netflix, they're gaming, they're Zooming, they're FaceTiming their friends. You know, a lot of international students are communicating with their loved ones, you know, in different time zones. And what we're finding a lot of the time is that the way that buildings were built back in the day didn't account for this. Students weren't in their rooms very much, they were out partying. And that just isn't the case anymore. They're taking studies much more seriously. It's costing a lot more. That, like we said before, they've become much more insular. So that's one way. The other way is, you know, student accommodation has evolved with ensuite rooms, and for some reason it's become the norm. And actually there's a lot of research that says students would, you know, quite happily, you know, share a bathroom between 4 people if it was a nice bathroom, to bring the cost down. And we're not really seeing that kind of differentiator of product at the moment. It's all, you know, we have generally 6-7 bedroom cluster flats, and we have studios, and we've got nothing in between or below. So, you know, if there is demand, which we're seeing already in Gen Z, and that might continue for different types of product that will suit different budgets and different needs. Like Stuart said, you know, the kind of the rise of neurodivergency, you know, actually for a lot of people, living in 8-10 bedroom flats is just not something that people will be comfortable with or will thrive in. So will we see more kind of smaller flats, 3 and 4 bedroom flats? So yeah, I'm not sure like how much, you know, much more can be done with a 13 square metre room other than a decoration point of view. Technology will play a part in the room, but I said also those kind of configurations. And I think as well, you know, we talk a lot about mental well-being with young people, and there's a lot of great operators that are doing fantastic things, but we're not really looking at how a building can support well-being. So like I said, soundproofing is one of those. If people are getting a great night's sleep, then they're more likely to be able to cope with the day ahead of them. But we talk about Passive House and different types of initiatives that actually create healthy buildings. I've seen that in the hotel industry. We've seen it in people, you know, building offices. You know, again, will that come into more into student accommodation and co-living in the future? Because that's, you know, that's helping to support well-being at the source rather than just the symptoms.
Yeah, Stuart, this is an interesting point. You know, technology is such a staple of this cohort's lives, but you know, everybody needs to decompress from technology and step away from it. How do you think accommodation can help in that process? What will it need to provide to give these students and co-living residents opportunities and activities to help them, what's the phrase, digital detox, if you like, or just kind of step away from that stuff into the good old-fashioned analog world?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because this is something that when we were thinking of the brand and where do we go, you know, what do we call ourselves and why, and trying to find a real meaning behind it. This was a kind of real thing for us, because it was something that I felt, again, not from a generational point of view, this was across generations, but I think everyone feels that we are on our phones too much as as a society now, we are addicted to these. And then you throw in children are at the moment coming through, spending their whole lives and not knowing any different, don't remember what it was like before. How do you then try and think about what life is like without that? So Mies kind of comes from that kind of Scandinavian philosophy centered around well-being, which was around trying to, you know, put the phones away, be present in that kind of cozy living point. So you go back into the design of the buildings, as Sarah's touched on, how do you kind of find those kind of quiet spaces or places that people can go away and not have phones, or can kind of connect with people around them or the environment in which they choose to do? I think in the wider piece, then you look at the kind of the social opportunities here for operators, which I think specifically in the student accommodation sector, I think some, you know, have been in this journey for a long time, and I think there's some real positive things that happen within the sector, whether that's kind of social events and opportunities to meet people within the residences, because ultimately this is a real benefit of going into something like co-living or student accommodation, is that you are living with, you know, there's lots of people around for you to connect with, rather than going into, say, an HMO flat where you're only sharing with 3-4 people and don't maybe have those same connections. The amenity space that you touched on being designed and flexible enough in a way for people to again come and use the space in which they and how they choose to use it. And I think the next step really then comes into this kind of partnership and community side, which is actually about not just then focusing on who's in the 4 walls of the building that you're actually in, but going out into your local community and providing that opportunity for people to, whether it's to do with volunteering or have real impact in that community. And again, I think this is something we'll definitely see in Gen Alpha, but right, again, we see right across all the generations as kind of this purpose and social value all becomes more important to us. So getting those opportunities out in communities, having local partnerships with businesses there where you can start to have that impact, I think become really key to providing those opportunities. And with that will come potentially employment opportunities. And these are all things that, again, when you look at that cost of living crisis and things that the students are actually coming through, it gives real advantages to them and allows them to stay in. And then the final point, I think, is when you look at the kind of, one of the things I've been kind of reading about recently is how kind of separation fuels stereotyping. And then you start thinking about, you know, is student accommodation the way it should be when you're not being able to live and connect with people along those generations, when you take a bunch of 18 to 23-year-olds and put them in it together? But I think actually what does go right through is that is a shared experience that you get in that period of your life. And that's where you need to deliver a very specific set of support or guidance to people within that cohort. So there's absolutely still a great place for PBSA, but actually getting that opportunity for people to kind of the benefit of intergenerational connectivity, if you like, where you get that opportunity to learn. And that's where I think PBSA operators and universities can continue to do more with people within that local community.
Great stuff. Thank you, Stuart. Lucy, we've already established that Gen Alphas are very brand aware, brand literate, and that Instagram is a hugely important part of their online activity. What implications does this have for marketing to them, making them aware of accommodation products, travel products, and hotels? Are they going to be an audience which is almost entirely targeted through social media rather than more traditional means?
Yeah, I think pretty much so. I mean, it's interesting. Nike have already talked about, there's already this transition, and this is being led by research by Bain, and also by statements by the CEO of Nike globally, really thinking of them already now as a very precocious and advanced consumer who is hugely brand literate. So sort of understanding luxury, for example, decoding brands, and so expecting that level of sophistication that we might have seen from brands aimed at Gen Zs and older consumers before. I just wondered if you don't mind to return to that, the neurodiverse thought, because I think there's going to be a lot to learn from what's happening in the wider cultural and hospitality space, where there's a lot of research looking at neuroaesthetics. For example, Google in its flagship has redesigned it around colors, shapes, and textures that promote well-being. Thomas Heatherwick, the architect, has been talking about built environments and nature and more interesting buildings that like really support mental health and well-being. IKEA has been doing a lot looking at community design and connection and how that relates to mental health. And then in cultural institutions, specifically looking at Gen Alpha, there's a lot of emphasis among designers and architects on neurodiversity and just universal design generally, and making that a standard. And I think that's, you know, we've heard about this a little bit before, that's actually becoming like a macro cultural trend, as in sort of making every space accessible and it being implicit rather than called out necessarily. But definitely you're seeing a lot of innovation in Gen Alpha spaces currently and it's not just even in design, it's in the programming, it's in the lighting, it's in sound control, as we've heard, soundproofing, having times where it's quieter, less stimulating. And I think more and more you're going to see this emphasis on sort of wellness architecture and wellness, bigger public spaces that are supportive to people who are neurodiverse, but of all abilities, and that will become a base rate expectation for Gen Alphas as well.
Okay, interesting stuff. Sarah, moving back onto the branding and marketing piece, which do you think will be the most effective marketing channels for accommodation providers? And is the market going to become more competitive, and as potential residents are putting brand high on their list of must-haves, as well as all the facilities and amenities that they're expecting?
I think that Gen Alpha are growing up with TikTok, you know, more so than other social media platforms, and they're totally influenced by it. If you ask Gen Z about if they would buy into influencers, they say no, but Gen Alpha absolutely are, and whether they know it or not, and maybe they're too young to realize that that's how they're being influenced, but they absolutely are, and YouTube as well. It's interesting though, because you know, I'm a marketeer, and young people don't tend to buy through those platforms, so they'll use it as a research tool, but they're still, after that, they're checking the review page, you know, the review sites, they're checking the portals to see what people are saying about it. They then might check somebody's Instagram to check that they're authentic and they are who they say they are, and then they'll go to the company's website. They'll probably then check who's behind the company and, you know, their policies, their you know, their diversity and inclusion policies, their ESG policies. So, and I think, you know, I think Stuart alluded to it before, is the kind of, you know, being honest and transparent. And because these young people have got all this information at their fingertips, that has to be squeaky clean. There's nowhere to hide. And they know that, you know, the younger generation have only ever used the internet to find things out. So they can find it, they'll just Google. And, you know, I don't think they'll be buying into businesses that have got any grey corners, anything that they don't kind of buy into. So I think that's going to be the biggest part is, and I kind of found an example on it with EasyJet this week, looking into their diversity and inclusion. Their webpage hadn't been updated for a number of years, and to me that felt dishonest. And, you know, not that I'm not going to potentially fly with EasyJet again, but if I was looking for employment, that's the kind of thing that you would question. It didn't take me long to find that out either, and think, you know, Gen Alpha are going to be totally on it. So I think, I don't know that it's more about marketing. I think it's more about communications.
Okay, Lucy, did you want to come in on that? I saw your hand flashed up on this.
Yeah, I see this a lot with Gen Zs, but it is sort of showing up among, I totally agree with that, Sarah. This, I wouldn't say distrust, but like the idea of distrusting mainstream traditional media channels is actually becoming like a widespread idea among this group, and they are hyper researchers, so sort of turning to Reddit. They're a Trustpilot generation, and looking totally to TikTok as an alternative news source. So I do think there is going to be a whole reframing of how, even if you're thinking about crisis comms, I don't know how much student accommodation might have a crisis communication issue, but when you're thinking about that kind of thing, there is the whole way that, and how they're looking to trusted information and where they get that from is changing as well, I would say.
Yeah, interesting. Sarah, as the mother of an alpha, I'm interested to hear what you make of a recent Expedia study about how much influence that kids have in the decision-making process around leisure activities, holidays, travel, and this kind of thing. They were saying that in at least 60% of families, it's a very democratic process. Is that reflected in your family, and do you think that's the norm? I mean, when we were kids, it was like, get in the car, we're going camping in Dorset, you know, that was that consultation involved.
So I've got 3 children. The Gen Alpha one is the youngest. So we can't have too much of a democratic society in this household because the 3 of them never agree on anything. What I would say is that they probably are influenced by what they see, particularly on TikTok in certain instances. So for example, a trip to London wouldn't be complete without them insisting that we go to the latest TikTok craze food outlet. And that sometimes means queuing around the block for some cheap, like chips that are topped with something, because that's what they've seen and it's like the craze, and then they can post about it and they look really cool. So I don't, you know, that hasn't kind of influenced so far in holidays. And I do quite often say, well, when you're paying for it, then you can decide. But until that point, like I said, yeah, it's difficult meeting different requirements. And also meeting different requirements, really, I guess. I've got children that between 12 and 16, and the 16-year-old is almost at university, very much still, you know, showing Gen Z ideologies, really, whereas the 12-year-old is Gen Alpha and really different. I don't know if that's because one's a boy, one's a girl, there's 4 years between them, but actually the way that they make decisions, the way that they research, the way they act is really, really different.
What would you say are the main differences in how they go about it? It's not much of an age gap between them, is it?
No, I think it is that influence thing, really. I think the 16-year-old is much more skeptical and is almost like kind of anti-popular media, really. Whereas the 12-year-old, like, is, you know, if I don't even know what they're called, you know, Mr. So-and-so says buy it, then he'll totally believe that. He's not mature enough, sensible enough, or old enough to question a lot of those things yet. I'd like to think he'll get there. Whereas the 16-year-old is, you know, she's not on a lot of social media. She's and I think that's quite typical of a lot of Gen Zers. They kind of come out the other side and are rejecting a lot of social media for whatever reason, maybe COVID, just their age and generation, whereas the younger ones, I think, are still totally being influenced by it. And they, you know, I really, really hate the fact that schools set their homework on apps, so that, you know, the older ones have come through school probably only relying on that since COVID, because it was a necessity during the COVID years, whereas the younger kids have come through with an, you know, having their homework set digitally. I absolutely hate it, because when you're trying to ban phone and restrict time on screens, it's like, well, I've got to do my homework. And, you know, they're totally right. So I do think that, you know, we're talking about Gen Alpha here. That's the generations that comes through there. You know, we talk about people being digital natives, but that's almost underplaying, I think, some of these Gen Alphas. You know, we can't, if you put yourselves in their shoes and what their lives are like, they almost don't have the choice to switch off from digital, whereas, you know, the rest of us kind of do.
That's an interesting thought. Whereas, they don't have the experience of anything else, so they don't necessarily know how to access it. It's fascinating stuff. I'd just like to finish by asking you all in turn what your main piece of advice would be to companies who are preparing their businesses to embrace Gen Alpha as their next big customer cohort in 5 or 6 years' time. What's the most important thing that they should remember? Lucy, I'm going to chuck that one to you first.
I think if you're thinking about the next 5 years, at the moment, as I sort of mentioned, there's a lot of influence of although they have a lot of agency, influence of their parents in terms of how brands are being executed to position themselves for them. And I think increasingly, and you mentioned this earlier about there not being that much data and not that much research about them as a generation and a consumer in their own right, and what their formative experiences might mean for emotional touch points, what they want. And so I think it will be starting to think of them less of the children of their parents and more as the consumer in their own right, and thinking about more strategically about what that will mean going forward. And I think that will be on the point of the millennial aesthetic, moving on from that. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Thanks, Lucy. Stuart, how about you?
I find that really, really tricky. The more I think about it, I think two things for me would be, I still think that what we're talking about here in terms of life cycle effects on people and generations, that there's going to be a lot of similarities in what we've dealt with over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And I think we all kind of think back with rose-tinted glasses on different parts of our life, or sometimes the opposite, thinking about the bad things or the good things that might come in those times, and have a real tinted view on what our experience of that was. But ultimately, an 18-year-old now still has a lot of the same challenges an 18-year-old would have had 10, 20 years ago, and providing a lot of the progressive support and guidance and experience that's been happening in these spaces, and that will just continue to progress, I think is all really positive. I think that the point from me, aside from technology, which again I think is the way that the world is going anyway, I think comes back to this importance of brand and standing for something. And I think Sarah touched on that. It's not just about putting a statement out; it's being able to kind of stand behind that. So if you just look at it purely through an ESG lens, I think there's so much good work happens in the E and the S, but actually finding a G, which means that you can really stand behind what you're saying, will be important from that kind of brand element. So that would probably be my look forward piece on that.
Yeah, thank you. And finally, Sarah.
I think I'm going to stick by technology, really, just because I think it's probably the hardest one to invest, because technology is moving all the time. But I don't think we can underestimate how much tricky, convoluted technology when it comes to booking accommodation could potentially turn the future consumer off. And I also think that we need to consider not just neurodiversity, but also kind of gender fluidity as well. You know, I'm still seeing forms that are being filled in that, you know, are asking for Mr., Mrs., that are saying, are you female or male? And I just think that something like that would turn someone off from a brand if they don't feel like it's inclusive, if it's not somewhere that they feel they can be part of. And that's a very, very different place to where a lot of decision makers have come from. But we have to be thinking forward, and we have to be thinking about the customer first, and the customer, whatever way we like to think about it, is so different. I don't think that there's another generation that has probably been through so much change probably since the Second World War. You know, what young people have kind of seen and changed in the last kind of, you know, 10, 15 years is absolutely huge. So it's not surprising that the way that we work, the way that we operate needs to be different, really.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. And it needs to evolve quickly, because, you know, they're going to be knocking on your doors soon. Really fascinating discussion. Thank you all, and I hope you found that useful in the audience. It's quite striking, actually, how little we do know about these guys. There's going to have to be a lot of learning done over the next few years. If you'd like to carry on the conversation with our panelists, their LinkedIn profiles are in the chat, so do drop them a line and carry on the conversation if you'd like to. I'm going to show a couple of quick slides, and then we will leave the session open for a couple of minutes so you can take some notes from all the chat. The next Urban Living webinar is on May the 10th, and it's about investment and lending into the living space. Very pertinent topic at the moment. The link to register for that is in the chat. If you'd like to work with us at Urban Living or across any of our other brands, IHM, either online or in-person events, get in touch with my colleague Henry, whose details are on the screen and also in the chat. And finally, thanks for watching. Thanks for your time. Thanks to our panelists for their fantastic insights. Enjoy the rest of your day. Have a great weekend, and I'll hopefully see you on another webinar soon. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Hello, we are International Hospitality Media, or IHM for short. IHM is the #1 brand to engage with decision makers in hospitality and real estate. Our 4 multimedia brands lead their respective sectors with breaking news, comments, trends and opinion across a variety of multimedia solutions. We provide an inspirational community to connect people through world-class events, webinars, podcasts, award schemes and much more. But let us share our story of who we are and what we do. Over 10 years ago, Piers & George had a light bulb moment to provide expert opinion, comments and low-cost digital content. And so they went on a journey over the past decade, creating media platforms to serve the hospitality and real estate industries. We now have an engaged audience with a reach of over 60,000 monthly visitors across our website, 48,000 of our email database across all the sectors, and over 67,000 across our social channels. Everything we do believe in challenging the status quo. We believe in thinking differently. We make things simple and very easy to work with us. And we're a friendly bunch too. We offer creative solutions to help you achieve your business goals. Read, watch, listen, meet with IHM. Contact us for a chat today. Just look at some of the brands we have worked with recently.